The message arrived in silence, short and cruel, cutting through what should have been an ordinary evening. Just one sentence about needing space, yet it was enough to make the apartment feel smaller, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Ethan Cole stared at his phone longer than necessary, not because he failed to understand the words, but because he understood too well what hid behind the gaps. 30 seconds passed slow and heavy. He typed a brief, polite reply that invited no further explanation, the kind of answer given by someone who has learned when silence is safer than belief. Across the city, Natalie Cole set her phone down on the edge of a hotel bed and exhaled as if she had just come up for air. She believed she had done enough. A message vague and clean, and it was over. She did not realize that this neatness was the first crack. Ethan stood still in the kitchen, the yellow light reflecting off the cold stone counter. Years of measuring risk had taught him that liars usually talk too much, filling silence with words. Natalie had done the opposite, and that silence spoke louder than any excuse. He looked around the apartment. Everything was in its place, yet nothing felt the same. The wedding photo on the shelf seemed slightly tilted, the smiles inside it suddenly unfamiliar. Back then, Ethan had been younger, less guarded, convinced that love could smooth every edge of life. Natalie in the picture was radiant, her hand gripping his, as if making a promise meant to last forever. He stepped into the bedroom and opened the closet. It was too tidy. The small purple overnight bag Natalie used for short trips was gone, while the large suitcase still sat untouched, dusty on the top shelf. In the bathroom, her toothbrush and contact lens solution were missing, but the expensive face cream remained the one she never traveled without, because she hated dry skin. Small disconnected details began linking themselves together in Ethan's mind. Somewhere else, Natalie sat on the bed, in a thin robe, staring out the window, at city lights shattered across the glass. She told herself she deserved this, that she needed to feel wanted, seen. Ethan barely crossed her mind, and if he did, it was like a soft knock she chose not to answer. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, his phone once again in his hand. The shared family phone plan they had chosen to save money became an open door to the truth. He logged in calmly, step by step. The map loaded, spun briefly, then stopped. A blue dot appeared where it should not have been. Not at the airport, not on the long road to the desert city where Natalie's mother lived, but in the heart of downtown on top of a hotel overlooking the water. The timestamp placed her there the night before, while Ethan believed she was flying off to seek comfort with family. Upstairs in that hotel, Natalie laughed and rested her hand on the arm of the man beside her, taller than Ethan, dressed with ease, an expensive watch catching the lobby lights. He moved through places like this with familiarity, straight into the elevator without hesitation. Ethan took a screenshot, a small but decisive act. He did not call, did not text, did not rush out in anger. The old version of him might have, the underestimated husband, the man who trusted confrontation and explanations. This version closed the door on emotion and opened another place in his mind where his real power waited quietly. Natalie did not know. She believed everything was under control. She could not see the man a few miles away, staring directly at the truth, not shaking, not shouting, only preparing. And in that silence, the first gear of a much larger machine had begun to turn. The blue dot on the map did not just sit there. It pulsed like a Chuji heartbeat, steady and indifferent. Right in the middle of the city, Ethan believed his wife had already left. The truth did not scream. It simply existed, exposed and unapologetic. Ethan did not rush. He placed the phone on the table and left it there for a few seconds, as if allowing himself to breathe with the room. Outside the window, Seattle stretched beneath a thin veil of rain car lights, dragging into trembling streaks. He knew this moment would split his life into two parts, before and after, and he also knew that if he reacted the wrong way, everything that followed would be nothing but meaningless wreckage. In Ethan's mind, the pieces began lining up on their own. He remembered the evenings Natalie said she had to stay late at the office for urgent campaigns. He remembered cold dinners, casual apologies. Back then, he had believed he was simply a husband who was not exciting enough, a man who worked with spreadsheets and risk easy to underestimate in a world of lights and stages. But that was only the surface. Beneath it, Ethan was trained to see what others missed. He opened his laptop. The glow of the screen lit a face calm to the point of being unsettling. There were no tears, no trembling, only precise clicks. The shared credit card account appeared. Small repeated transactions scattered like footprints in snow. Dinner charges near the hotel parking fees room service. None large enough to raise suspicion on their own, but together they told a complete story. Ethan took notes line by line, day by day. He was not searching for proof to torture himself, he was building a file. Across the city, Natalie stepped onto the hotel balcony. Cold wind lifted her hair, carrying the smell of rain and metal. She closed her eyes and told herself she just needed a little more time, that Ethan would be fine, as he always was. She did not realize she was standing on a chessboard, where her opponent had already begun to see the entire game. Ethan switched to the shared calendar they had created to organize their lives. The empty spaces in Natalie's schedule aligned strangely well with the nights of those card transactions. He did not smile, but something cold slid through his chest. Suspicion now had a shape. It was no longer a feeling, it was data. His phone vibrated softly. A new message from Natalie asking how his workday was going. The words were sweet and familiar, as if nothing had changed. Ethan replied with a brief symbol, just enough to maintain the illusion. He understood that every sentence he chose not to speak right now was a step he took ahead. In Natalie's mind, reassurance settled in. She believed the distance was doing its job, that everything was still under control. The man in the bathroom, the one she had just been laughing with, had no idea that a thin thread was slowly tightening around the neck of his life. Ethan opened a new tab and searched for private investigation offices in the area, not because he enjoyed the idea of surveillance, but because he needed someone who saw the world with the same cold clarity he did. He read every page, every review, missing nothing. At the same time, he opened a list of divorce attorneys, not to sign anything yet, but to understand what paths were available to him. A memory flickered through his mind the day he and Natalie signed the lease for this apartment. She had laughed and said he was always too careful. Ethan had laughed along, hiding the truth that caution was how he protected what he loved. Now that same caution was becoming the only weapon he trusted. He sent a few short, emotionless emails, requesting information, then closed the laptop. In the quiet apartment, the sound of rain against the glass grew sharper. Ethan stood, poured a glass of water, drank slowly. His body was still here, but his mind had already moved into a different phase, the phase of decisions. At the hotel, Natalie returned to the room, pulled on her robe, and leaned against the door. She thought about Ethan, about the stability he represented, and about the thrill she was chasing. She did not know that the stability she dismissed was far less fragile than she believed. It was simply silent, waiting for the right moment. When Ethan turned off the lights and stepped into the bedroom, he did not look at the wedding photo anymore. He knew enough for tonight. In the darkness, he closed his eyes and did not let sleep come too quickly. He allowed his thoughts to flow evenly, like a river that had finally found its direction. And somewhere very close and very real, the second gear of an invisible machine slid quietly into place. The elevator doors closed, and in that brief moment, a smile appeared and vanished as if it had never existed. No one in the hotel lobby realized that in that second, everything had crossed a line from which there was no return. Ethan Cole did not witness the scene firsthand. yet he felt it as an invisible pressure tightening around his chest. The next morning, he woke earlier than usual. The city was still half asleep, a pale gray light settling over the rooftops. He brewed coffee and leaned against the window, watching the thin flow of traffic below. There was no storm inside him, only a cold, sharpened focus, the same focus he carried before making the most consequential decisions of his career. At the hotel, Natalie woke up in a room that felt unfamiliar, yet disturbingly familiar at the same time. The scent of clean sheet sunlight slipping through heavy curtains, the distant echo of traffic. The man beside her turned in his sleep, muttering something before drifting back under. Natalie stared at the ceiling as emptiness seeped into her thoughts. She told herself everything was still fine, that this was only a necessary pause, before life returned to its old rhythm. She did not know that someone else had already redrawn that rhythm. Ethan sat at his computer as replies began appearing in his inbox. A private investigation office in the northern part of the city responded first. The tone was brief, professional, stripped of emotion. He read carefully and marked it. Another message arrived from a family law attorney, equally concise, offering nothing beyond an initial consultation. Ethan did not rush. He let the options rest there, like chess pieces, waiting to be moved at the right moment. He opened the location map again. The blue dot was moving slowly now, leaving the hotel and sliding through familiar streets. Natalie was driving, heading toward the office. That made Ethan pause for a second. A very small, very human part of him still wanted to believe there might be an explanation. But data does not lie, and the data was telling a clearer story by the minute. Natalie pulled into the company parking garage with a knot of conflicting emotions in her chest. She adjusted her jacket, took a deep breath, and placed a professional smile on her face. Colleagues greeted her. Everything looked normal. Yet deep inside, she felt as if she were walking on a thin wire. The man from the night before drifted through her thoughts, along with promises that had no name or shape. She believed she was skilled enough to keep everything separate. Meanwhile, Ethan created a new folder on his laptop. He named it simply Without Emotion. Inside, he saved screenshots, credit card statements, schedules. He organized them chronologically like an internal report. Each file was a fragment of truth, and each fragment pulled him farther away from the image of the underestimated husband. He called the first private investigation office. The man on the other end of the line spoke in a low, even voice, neither curious nor judgmental. They agreed to meet at a small coffee shop near the highway, a place where quiet conversations blended into background noise. Ethan ended the call, feeling the decision lock firmly into place. At the office, Natalie sat in front of her screen, trying to focus on the words in front of her. Her phone vibrated softly. A message from Ethan, short and neutral. She exhaled in relief. His calm reassured her, convincing her he suspected nothing. She did not realize that calm was the most dangerous thing of all. The meeting happened at midday. The investigator had a face that disappeared easily into a crowd, eyes that revealed nothing. Ethan spoke briefly, laying out what he had. The other man nodded, asked only what needed to be asked, nothing more. No judgment, no sympathy, just work. Elsewhere in the city, the man who had spent the night with Natalie stepped out of his company elevator, straightened his tie, and walked with his usual confidence. He had no idea his name was about to be placed into the same folder as evidence that could never be erased. The afternoon dragged on. Ethan returned to the apartment and sat alone in silence. He thought about Natalie, about the years they had built together, and about how everything could collapse because of a series of choices. He did not feel hatred, not yet. Only a cold, hollow space where resolve was quietly growing. When night fell, Natalie left the office late. She checked her phone and saw no new messages. A flicker of unease passed through her. Then she pushed it aside. She told herself tomorrow would be different, that everything would be fine. Ethan, sitting in the darkness after turning off the lights, understood that from this moment on, everything had entered a new chapter. No more suspicion, no more vague feelings. The third gear had clicked into place, and the machine was gaining speed. The first photograph arrived in his inbox before dawn had a chance to touch the water. Natalie walked into the hotel lobby, and behind her, a man with a familiar posture followed, confident enough to feel no need to hide. Ethan Cole stared at the screen without blinking, not from shock, but from confirmation. Every doubt he had carried over the past days now had a clear shape. Morning light spilled into the apartment, cutting his face into sharp contrasts of light and shadow. He drew a slow breath steady and controlled the way he did before meetings that decided outcomes no one else could see coming. At the hotel, Natalie stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her hair, adding a final layer of lipstick. She told herself she only needed to get through a few more days, that everything would settle after that. The man stepped out of the bathroom, the scent of expensive cologne spreading lightly through the room. He said something that made Natalie laugh, a natural laugh, freer than any she had allowed herself in months. She did not know that moment had already been frozen inside a frame ready to follow her far longer than she imagined. Ethan opened a new folder and gave it a short, neutral name. Inside, he saved the images in chronological order. The lobby, the elevator, the hallway, the door. Each photo carried a timestamp steady and relentless, like the ticking of a clock that refused to stop. He did not let emotion interfere. He reviewed, categorized, annotated, as if handling a case that belonged to someone else entirely. Another message came from the investigator, precise and cold. The room had been booked continuously. Not one night, not a single mistake. A routine. Ethan felt a hollow space open inside his chest, not painful, just cold. He had been underestimated for years, seen as a man who would accept things quietly. But inside that hollow space, something else was growing, the power that comes from holding information. Natalie stepped into the elevator, her hand resting on the man's arm. The doors closed. No one in the lobby noticed. To them, it was just two professionals starting their day. To Ethan, it was proof that a boundary had already been erased. He shut the laptop and stood pacing through the apartment. Each step echoed clearly. He looked at the wedding photo one last time that morning, not with bitterness, but with a sharp, painful clarity. He understood that love had once existed, and he also understood it had ended long before he was ready to admit it. At the office, Natalie moved through her day as usual. Meetings followed, meetings. She spoke, smiled, persuaded. No one could see how a series of choices was slowly carrying her farther from solid ground. The man sat on the top floor of the building, signing documents, giving orders accustomed to the world bending to his will. He had no idea his name had just been added to a file that was growing thicker by the hour. Ethan returned to his own desk, though his mind was elsewhere. He sent a few more emails, brief and emotionless. A lawyer replied faster than he expected, suggesting a meeting. Ethan noted the time. Everything was falling into line. By midday, the investigator sent more photos. The man walked out of a parking garage and accepted an envelope from a stranger. The movement was quick, efficient, practiced. Ethan paused. This was no longer only a story of personal betrayal. His professional instincts rose sharply. Years spent analyzing risk had taught him that when someone hides one thing, they are usually hiding many more. Natalie ate lunch alone, scrolling through her phone, seeing no new messages from Ethan. A thin line of unease passed through her, then faded. She believed his silence meant acceptance. She did not realize it meant preparation. As afternoons slipped away, Ethan sat in the apartment, late sunlight stretching across the floor. He organized the files again, backing them up, storing copies in multiple places. Not out of fear, but out of respect for certainty. Each copy was another layer of protection. When night fully settled, Natalie left the office. She watched the city lights come alive, feeling both exhausted and exhilarated. She believed she was controlling the story. Somewhere else, Ethan stood at the window, looking down at the flowing lines of traffic. He was no longer asking what was happening. He knew, and in that knowledge, he felt a calm that was almost frightening. The fourth gear slid into place. There was no slowing now, no hesitation. The machine had shifted into the rhythm of truth. ChatGPT ko the McLoy. Hei kim trakak tong tin quan trong. Vui longtam kau tui chon cookie. The meeting with the lawyer happened sooner than Ethan had expected, and the moment the office door closed behind him, he understood this was no longer a story about emotion, but a battlefield already mapped out. One signature could end everything, or it could set off a collapse that no one would be able to stop. Ethan Cole sat upright in the dark leather chair, his hands resting loosely on his knees. The office was filled with morning light, orderly and cold. Marina Voss, the woman across from him, flipped through the documents with unsettling calm. Her eyes were sharp, surgical, accustomed to peeling truth away from human disguise. She did not ask Ethan how he felt. She asked him where he wanted to go. Ethan answered slowly. He said he was not looking for impulsive revenge. He wanted fairness. He wanted to leave a marriage that had already been betrayed, and if possible protect himself from things that had not yet fully surfaced. Marina nodded the corners of her lips, lifting into a very thin smile. She said fairness was a luxury, but the law was precise, and the law demanded evidence, patience, and exact timing. Across the city, Natalie walked into an important meeting, wearing confidence she had practiced carefully. She did not know that each step she took was being recorded in another file, where her name was no longer tied to successful campaigns, but to a sequence of bad choices. The man at the head of the table spoke about next quarter goals, his voice calm and authoritative. He believed he controlled everything: budgets, people, outcomes. Marina slid a slim stack of papers toward Ethan and explained the possible scenarios. If Ethan moved too quickly, everything would dissolve into emotional confrontation. If he waited, gathered enough proof, and allowed the other side to expose itself, the outcome would be entirely different. Ethan listened, his mind running smoothly, like a machine that had been oiled for this exact language. Strategy, timing, consequences. He signed the authorization form with a decisive stroke. No shaking, no hesitation. In that moment, the image of the quiet, easily overlooked husband was officially erased. In its place stood a man who understood that power did not come from raising one's voice, but from controlling the narrative. Natalie left the meeting with a tired smile and sent Ethan a short message asking whether he would be home for dinner. She did not realize that every message like that was becoming another piece placed neatly into a much larger picture. When Ethan replied with a neutral sentence, she felt relief. His silence was still mistaken for acceptance. That afternoon, Ethan met the investigator again. The cafe was crowded loud enough to swallow low voices. The man placed a thin envelope on the table. Inside were new photographs, brief notes. Not just the hotel, not just repeated nights. There were quick meetings in parking garages, hurried handshakes, envelopes changing hands. Ethan did not ask many questions. He only looked and understood. At the office, Natalie sat alone as darkness fell. She stared out through the glass city lights reflecting back at her, making her face look unfamiliar. A sense of unease crept in, vague but persistent. She told herself it was just exhaustion, that everything would be fine once Ethan adjusted to this distance. Ethan returned to the apartment, set the envelope on the table, and opened his laptop. He no longer felt pain when looking at the evidence. Emotion had given way to cold focus. He backed up the files, reorganized them, added notes. Every action had a purpose. Every decision pointed toward a path with no return. That night, Ethan stood by the window for a long time. The city below him remained loud and careless, as if nothing was changing. But he knew some lines had already been crossed. Somewhere Natalie believed she was still controlling the game. Somewhere else the powerful man believed every secret would stay buried. They did not know that a new chain of gears had just locked into place, tight and precise. No noise, no spectacle. And when the machine began to run at full speed, no one would be able to pretend they had not seen what was coming. ChatGPT code the mekloi. Haikiem trakatstong. The knock came in the middle of a quiet afternoon firm, and deliberate the kind that did not allow anyone to pretend they had not heard it. Natalie opened the door, wearing a thin jacket, and in the instant her eyes fell on the envelope in the stranger's hand. The familiar world she knew collapsed without warning. The woman standing there spoke calmly, introduced herself as a legal representative, and extended the envelope, explaining everything in a short, precise tone, like reading an administrative notice. Natalie took it with trembling hands. She did not need to open it to feel its weight. She stood frozen in the cold hotel hallway as the blood drained from her face. The man behind her asked what was happening, his voice rising with irritation. Natalie did not answer. She only turned to him and whispered a single clipped sentence, telling him to leave immediately. Elsewhere in the city, Ethan Cole stood by the window of the apartment, his phone silent in his hand. He knew this moment had arrived not because of intuition, but because everything had been arranged in the correct order. When the lawyer told him the timing was right, he had not asked questions. He had simply nodded. Now the machine was moving exactly as designed. Natalie slammed the hotel room door shut and leaned her back against the cold wood, her breath coming fast and shallow. She opened the envelope. The black and white words blurred before her eyes. A petition to terminate the marriage. Ethan's name stood there clearly cold and final, without a single explanation. No call beforehand, no warning, no chance to prepare. She felt betrayed in a different way, deeper and sharper, not because he wanted to leave, but because he had done it in silence. Natalie's phone began vibrating non-stop. Messages, calls, all from Ethan. She stared at the screen, her heart racing, but when she tried to call back, the call did not connect. For the first time in years, Natalie felt completely out of control. She was no longer the one setting the distance, the one deciding the rhythm of the relationship. The initiative had slipped entirely from her hands. In a conference room in another office building, the powerful man Natalie trusted sat upright as an assistant leaned in to whisper something in his ear. News traveled quickly, even when no one spoke it aloud. One brief glance was enough for him to understand that a problem was forming. He gave a thin smile, believing everything could be handled as it had been so many times before. He was accustomed to paperwork resolving all inconveniences. Ethan sat down at the kitchen table and opened his laptop. He did not look at his phone. He reviewed the files again, ensuring everything was copied, organized, ready. Not out of fear, but out of respect for the process. Emotion had not vanished from his mind, but it had been set aside. In its place was pure focus, the same focus that had once allowed him to stand firm when others fell apart. Natalie sat on the hotel bed, with her head lowered, her hands covering her face. She thought about the messages she had sent, the half-spoken explanations, the times she had convinced herself she was still in control. Now the truth had surfaced in the most brutal way. Ethan was not weak as she had believed. He did not need to shout. He did not need confrontation. He only needed to act. As evening approached, Natalie rushed out of the hotel. She dragged her suitcase across the lobby, avoiding the curious eyes of strangers. Each step pressed heavily against her chest. She called Ethan again and left a long message, her voice shaking, as she tried to explain to hold on. On the other end, there was no reply. Ethan stood in the dark apartment, the lights still off. Outside, the city lit up in scattered patches, traffic flowing like endless lines of thought. He felt his phone vibrate, saw Natalie's name appear, then disappear. He did not hate her, not now. He only understood that some doors once closed properly should never be opened again. Somewhere in a taxi leaving the hotel, Natalie sat alone watching the streets slide past, as fear began to replace her former confidence. In another high-rise building, the powerful man started to realize there were things money could not buy, and consequences that could no longer be postponed. That night, Ethan did not go to sleep right away. He sat still listening to the new silence filling the apartment. There was no more doubt, no more guessing. Only the truth, bare and irreversible. The sixth gear had locked firmly into place, and from this point on, every movement would be faster and stronger, and none of them would be able to pretend they did not know what was happening anymore. The next morning, Natalie received an email with no subject line, no greeting, no signature, only an attachment. When she opened it, her heart felt as if it were being crushed, because it was not a plea or a negotiation, it was evidence. Ethan Cole did not send that email, at least not directly. The file came from an intermediary address, cold and anonymous, mirroring exactly how he was operating now. Inside was a sequence of images, arranged chronologically neat, like an internal report. Natalie entering the hotel. Natalie leaving the hotel. Natalie inside the elevator. Natalie in the parking garage. Then the image that stole the air from her lungs. The powerful man accepting an envelope from a stranger. His eyes alert, his movements quick and practiced, frighteningly familiar. In another part of the city, Ethan sat in front of his screen and did not rewatch what he had arranged to be sent. He had seen enough. Years spent working in the world of risk and compliance had taught him that once the truth was placed in the right position, it created its own chain reaction. He did not need to explain. He only needed to place the pieces on the board. Natalie called Ethan immediately. The first call went unanswered. The second did the same. By the third, her voice had broken, shaking, stripped of its usual confidence. She left a long, disordered message, half explanation, half pleading, half accusation. She said things were not as simple as he thought. She said he did not understand the world she lived in. But deep down, Natalie knew what had just been sent was not an accusation. It was a mirror. In the conference room on the top floor of the office tower, the powerful man stood by the glass, looking down at the city. His phone vibrated lightly in his hand. A short message from Natalie, no longer coded, no longer subtle, only panic. His brow tightened. An assistant knocked and stepped inside, whispering something in his ear. His expression shifted in an instant. Calm vanished, replaced by calculation. Ethan met the investigator again that afternoon. This time, it was not a cafe. They sat inside a multi-level parking structure, the smell of oil and damp concrete clinging to the air. The investigator handed over another packet. Not just photos. There were schedules. There were invoices. There were money flows routed through companies with harmless-sounding names that had no real offices. Ethan did not need an explanation. He recognized the familiar structure of shell companies, the detours money takes when someone does not want to be seen. Meanwhile, Natalie sat alone in the temporary apartment she had rented, the curtains drawn tight. The glow of her phone screen lit her exhausted face. She reread the email again and again, each image cutting deeper. She began to understand that Ethan was not merely leaving her. He was reconstructing the entire narrative, and in that narrative, she was no longer the one holding the wheel. Ethan returned home as dusk settled. He placed the documents on the table, opened his laptop, and began to write. Not a love letter, not an accusation. It was a detailed memo describing what he observed, what he suspected, and what could be verified. The language was precise, emotionless, free of speculation. A document whose value was immediately clear to anyone familiar with law and process. At the office, the powerful man called a closed-door meeting. His voice remained low and controlled, but the hand resting on the table had clenched tight. He spoke about loyalty, about risk, about protecting the company from external threats. No one in the room realized that the greatest threat was not a competitor, but a man once dismissed as harmless, sitting quietly in an ordinary apartment, typing sentences that could change all of their lives. Natalie finally understood what frightened her most. It was not losing Ethan, it was realizing she had never truly understood him. The man she believed to be gentle and predictable was the only one in the room who knew how to stay calm when everything began to burn. When night fell, Ethan stopped typing and reread what he had written. He felt no triumph. There was no sense of victory, only clarity. He saved the file, backed it up once more, and closed the laptop. Outside, the city remained loud and unaware that another gear had just locked into the machine, accelerating beneath it. From this moment on, every attempt to hide would only make the truth surface faster. The internal bulletin was sent out early in the morning, brief and emotionless, yet within minutes it sent a ripple through the entire building. A surprise audit. No advance notice. No explanation. Ethan Cole read the notice on his phone once more, then set it down on the table. He was not surprised. In truth, he had been waiting for this moment. Inside the quiet apartment, sunlight cut diagonally through the curtains, falling across neatly stacked folders. He took a sip of coffee that had already gone cold, the familiar bitterness spreading across his tongue. Everything was moving in rhythm. Across the city, Natalie walked into the office building with a sense of unease she had never felt before. The atmosphere was different from any other day. Casual conversations had vanished. Colleagues' eyes slid past her more quickly, more cautiously. She noticed unfamiliar men in suits near the reception desk, speaking quietly with management. Her heart began to race. She knew this feeling was not without cause. The powerful man Natalie had trusted sat inside his private office with the door closed. On his desk were folders delivered overnight. He flipped through them page by page, his expression slowly tightening. Numbers, transfers, timelines aligned with brutal precision. He understood exactly what a surprise audit meant. It was not random. It had been triggered. Ethan was nowhere near any office. He sat in his apartment, laptop open, following short updates from his lawyer. No emotion, no judgment, just information. He had long been underestimated as someone outside the power game. In reality, he had simply chosen a different board, one where the rules were stricter and consequences could not be bought. Natalie was called into a small meeting room with frosted glass walls. Inside sat two people she had never met, along with a representative from Human Resources. The first question was asked gently, almost politely. She answered smoothly. The second question went deeper. She hesitated. When the photographs were placed on the table, Natalie's world tilted, not because she had never seen them before, but because she never expected to see them here in this context. She realized a cold truth. What Ethan had done was not aimed solely at a broken marriage. He had touched a much larger structure where every personal action left a trace. And when those traces were pulled into the light, no one could pretend to be uninvolved. The powerful man was invited into another room. This time, no assistant followed. No phone was allowed. No control over the narrative remained. He tried to keep his voice steady, but the questions left no space to evade. He began to understand that Ethan's silence had never been weakness. It had been strategy. In the apartment, Ethan stood and walked slowly across the room. He thought about the years behind him, about how often he had made himself smaller to keep peace, to avoid conflict. He once believed silence was sacrifice. Now he understood that silence could also be leverage if placed correctly. Natalie left the meeting room with heavy steps. She stared down the long hallway under harsh white lights. She thought about Ethan, about the messages she had sent, the words she had dismissed. She was finally beginning to see who he truly was, not through promises, but through the consequences spreading through the space around her. The afternoon dragged on under mounting tension. Rumors spread quickly. No one confirmed anything, yet everyone felt the shift. Doors closed, calls were postponed, smiles disappeared. A familiar system was beginning to shake. Ethan received a brief call from his lawyer. The voice on the other end remained calm. Things were progressing. He thanked her and ended the call. He felt no triumph, no relief, only a certainty taking shape that once the truth was placed where it belonged, it would find its own way forward. As night fell, Natalie sat alone in her car, hands resting on the steering wheel, watching streetlights stretch endlessly ahead. She was no longer thinking about saving anything. She was thinking about consequences. And Ethan, in his quiet apartment, shut his laptop and looked out over the city. He knew the eighth gear had begun to turn, and from this point on, no one would be able to stop the machine moving forward with empty words ever again. The hearing was scheduled on short notice, and Ethan Cole's name appeared unexpectedly on the list of key document providers. Not as a defendant, not as a fragile witness, but as the person holding the complete chain of evidence. That morning, Ethan put on a simple shirt sleeves, neatly rolled, and stood before the mirror in his quiet apartment. His face was calm, his eyes clear, already accustomed to pressure. He was not there to argue. He was there to place the truth on the table, exactly where it belonged. Outside, the city woke up indifferent, unaware that a balance was about to tilt. Natalie arrived at the legal building earlier than scheduled. She sat on a bench in the hallway, fingers interlaced, head lowered. The sound of footsteps echoed like metal, tapping directly on her nerves. She thought about the choices that had led her here, about how she once believed she controlled everything. That feeling had dissolved, replaced by a cold unease crawling along her spine. In a closed room upstairs, the powerful man entered wearing confidence he had practiced for years. His suit was immaculate, his familiar thin smile in place. He was used to speaking before crowds, to admiring looks. But today, the faces looking back at him were neutral, stripped of emotion. No one here needed to be convinced. Ethan was invited in last. He placed the folder on the table, each document clearly marked, organized with precision. When he began to speak, his voice was neither loud nor soft, only steady enough to be heard. He did not tell a personal story. He presented a sequence of events, time, locations, money flows, overlaps, everything connected like a map that had been drawn long ago. Natalie listened to every sentence, every word, and realized something that stole her breath. Ethan did not speak of her as a traitor. He spoke of her as a link. That hurt more than any accusation. It turned emotion into data mistakes, into consequences. When it was the powerful man's turn to speak, he began with his familiar composure. He talked about misunderstandings, about context, about difficult decisions. But when a document was slid across the table toward him, his voice faltered. Numbers, timelines, circular transactions. There was no space left for interpretation. Ethan remained still, hands resting on the table, not interrupting. He did not need to. The truth was speaking for itself. And in that moment, several people in the room understood that the man they had underestimated was never weak. He was simply more patient than they had imagined. The hearing stretched on. Questions followed questions. The noise of rumors was gone. Only the sound of turning pages and scribbling pens remained. Time slowed to a painful crawl for Natalie. She glanced at Ethan once and met his eyes. No hatred, no contempt, only resolve, like a door that had been closed properly. When everyone finally stood to leave, there were no congratulations, no sense of victory. This was not a place for emotion. This was a place for conclusions. The powerful man exited last his steps heavier than when he entered. Natalie stood up, feeling as if she had walked through a storm without realizing what she had lost until now. Ethan gathered his documents slowly. His lawyer nodded to him a look of acknowledgement. He returned the nod. No words were needed. In the hallway afternoon, light filtered through the glass walls stretching across the cold stone floor. Ethan walked on shoulders, straight pace, steady. Outside, Natalie stopped at the steps and drew a deep breath, the cold air stinging her eyes. She understood that what had just happened did not only change a job or a marriage. It changed how she saw the man who had once stood beside her. The man she believed to be gentle and easily hurt was the only one who had remained clear-headed when everything around them collapsed. Ethan left the building and stood beneath a pale gray sky. He felt neither relief nor heaviness, only a new, deeper quiet. The ninth gear had completed its turn, and from here on, the consequences would no longer belong to anyone's control. They would find their way to where they belonged on their own. The official decision was issued on a gloomy afternoon, and a single brief line was enough to sever the last remaining illusions. Temporary suspension of duties. Expansion of the investigation. Effective immediately. Ethan Cole read the notice on his screen, then closed the laptop. He did not smile. He did not exhale in relief. This moment did not feel like victory. It carried only a deeper silence. He knew what had just happened was not an ending, but another door opening, one where the truth would continue to move on its own without requiring him to push further. Inside the office building, Natalie stood in front of the elevator, her hand gripping the strap of her bag. News spread faster than she had expected. Avoided glances. Polite greetings vanished. She felt both invisible and unbearably heavy at the same time. As the elevator doors closed, her reflection faded on the dull metal surface, as if an older version of herself were slipping out of the frame. On another upper floor, the powerful man cleared his desk. No one said it out loud, yet everyone understood. His authority had been built on confidence and the silence of others. Now that silence had shifted direction. He made several phone calls, his voice low, carefully controlled. Some calls were not answered. Relationships that once seemed unbreakable began to fracture the moment light touched them. Ethan returned to the apartment just as night fell. He placed his keys on the table, hung his jacket, every movement familiar. The room itself had not changed, but the feeling inside it had. He thought about the years behind him, about how often he had accepted being underestimated to preserve peace. At the time, he believed it was maturity. Now he understood it had only been a choice. And choices can always be changed. Natalie drove aimlessly through familiar streets. Traffic lights shifted colors, cars flowed slowly around her. She remembered the times Ethan listened without interrupting, the evenings he stayed quiet while she spoke about her world. She once believed that silence meant indifference. Now it appeared as a form of inner discipline she had never learned to practice. Natalie's phone vibrated. A message from an old friend asking whether everything was all right. She did not reply. Some questions cannot be answered with words. She pulled over to the curb, turned off the engine, and let darkness fill the car. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself not to control, not to explain, not to justify. Ethan received a call from his lawyer. The familiar voice remained calm. The process was expanding. More documents would be requested. There might be additional sessions. Ethan listened, acknowledged, and thanked her. He did not ask how long it would take. He did not ask for outcomes. He understood that the process mattered more than the destination, and he had chosen to stand with the process. In the days that followed, pieces continued to fall into place. Some contracts were suspended. A few partners withdrew. Whispered conversations turned into public questions. Natalie watched everything from the outside, an unwilling spectator to her own life. She began to understand that collapse is not loud the way people imagine. It happens quietly through doors, closing through calls that are never returned. Ethan spent many evenings alone, not in loneliness, but in reordering. He cleared out things that were no longer necessary. Old papers, objects tied to memories that no longer fit. Each small action carried meaning, as if he were making room for another phase. One evening, Natalie stopped her car outside the old apartment. She sat there for a long time without getting out. Light spilled from the familiar window. She knew Ethan was inside, but she also knew there were distances that could not be crossed with words. She started the engine and drove away, leaving the quiet street behind her. Ethan stood by the window, looking down at the thinning traffic. He did not know Natalie had just passed by, and it no longer mattered. He felt a new balance forming, not built on control, but on clear boundaries. He had been underestimated because he did not perform. Now he understood that his strength lay in steadiness, in allowing the truth to complete its own work. When night fully settled, Ethan turned off the lights and sat still in the dark. There were no more gears to push. The machine was already moving on its own. What remained required no further action, only the grounded presence of someone who had learned not to turn back once the road ahead had become clear. ChatGPT ko the makloi, hei kiem trakach tong tin quan trong, vui long tam kau tui chon kuki. The courtroom was not as loud as Natalie had imagined, but the moment the judge read the decision, every other sound disappeared. Only the truth remained standing upright without needing to raise its voice. Ethan Cole sat still on the wooden bench, his hands resting lightly on his knees. Morning light streamed through the high windows, illuminating a face shaped by pressure and restraint. He did not look at Natalie as the ruling was delivered, not out of avoidance, but because he did not need to. What he had come to hear had already been said, long before, through documents, through process, through choices that could not be undone. Natalie stood on the opposite side, her shoulders slightly drawn inward, as if bracing against an invisible wind. She listened to every word, feeling them fall like cold stones. There was no harsh accusation, no moral speech, only conclusions, responsibility, consequence. In that moment, she understood that the most painful part was not loss, but clarity, ruthless and complete. The man who once stood above now sat lower, his face, maintaining a practiced calm, while his eyes had lost their former confidence. His lawyer took notes, nodded as if everything were merely procedural. But doors that close do not reopen through procedure. They reopen through time, and sometimes they do not reopen at all. Ethan was asked to stand and confirm a few final details. He answered briefly, precisely nothing, added nothing, withheld. Each sentence was a brick placed exactly where it belonged. In that room, many people realized for the first time the strength of someone who did not need to perform. He did not win through emotion. He won through steadiness. When the hearing ended, everyone rose almost at once. Chairs shifted. Papers were gathered. Footsteps echoed softly. Natalie turned to look at Ethan. Her eyes held many things at once: regret, anger, emptiness. Ethan met her gaze for a single breath. No coldness, no pity. Only acknowledgement that their shared path ended here. Outside, the sky was pale gray. Wind moved across the stone steps, carrying the scent of old rain. Natalie paused as if wanting to say something, then stopped. Some words arrived too late and ceased to be words at all, becoming only echoes. Ethan stepped down the stairs and felt the ground firm beneath his feet. He did not feel the relief people often speak of after major endings. He felt order, the kind built by naming things correctly. He thought of the long nights alone, the times he had been underestimated for not reacting, for not arguing. He once wondered if he was wrong. Now he did not. Natalie walked away in a different direction. In her mind, images overlapped the hotel, the meeting rooms, the long hallways, the unfamiliar looks from colleagues. She realized that what frightened her most was not an uncertain future, but the fact that she had misjudged the one person who had once stood beside her. Ethan's silence was not absence, it was foundation. The powerful man exited last, his phone buried deep in his pocket, no longer vibrating. He looked up at the sky and blinked as if the light were too bright. Some lessons do not need to be taught twice. They carve themselves in place when position changes. Ethan stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked back at the building one final time. No resentment, no attachment. He knew that from here on, consequences would continue along their own path. He did not need to follow them. He had done his part. The afternoon passed slowly. Ethan returned to the apartment, opened the windows, and let the wind move through the rooms. He cleared away a few remaining items, leftover papers, objects that no longer belonged to the present. Each small action felt like a punctuation mark, closing an old paragraph. As dusk settled, the city lights came on. Ethan sat down without turning on a screen or opening a file. He allowed the quiet to surround him, no longer heavy, but solid. The 11th gear completed its turn, not loudly, not dramatically, but as a new point of balance, where a man once underestimated stood firmly with nothing left to prove. The old key was returned in a thin envelope, placed quietly at the apartment door, on a calm morning, like a farewell that did not require an audience. Ethan Cole looked at it for a long time and understood that some endings need nothing more than silence. He did not open the envelope right away. He made coffee, opened the window, and let the early air move through a room that had become familiar in a new way. The city below continued its steady rhythm, never waiting for anyone to finish the past. Ethan stood there feeling a quiet lightness, the kind that comes from no longer needing to prove anything. He had once been underestimated because he did not react. Now that same composure was the foundation that allowed him to stand firm. Natalie was somewhere else in a smaller apartment where morning light slid across bare walls. She held her phone, scrolled through familiar names, then set it down. No more urgent calls. No more long explanations. She understood that the truth does not need repetition. It was already there, clear, and she had to live with it. What weighed on her was not the loss itself, but the late realization that the man who once stood quietly beside her possessed the strength of consistency, something she had never learned to value. Ethan packed one last time, not to erase memories, but to place them where they belonged. Items no longer needed were arranged neatly. Old documents were stored properly. Each movement confirmed that life does not stop after collapse. It simply changes direction. He opened his laptop not to search for evidence or track consequences, but to write a few lines for himself. Brief notes about principles, about boundaries, about choosing truth over comfortable illusion. Outside, whispered conversations slowly faded. People moved on to other topics. Doors that had closed opened differently, not to invite the past back in, but to let the future step forward. The man who once held power learned a different kind of silence, not as strategy, but as acceptance. Natalie learned to slow down, no longer letting control lead the way, allowing responsibility to set the pace. One afternoon, Ethan walked along a familiar street and stopped at the old cafe. The barista greeted him with the same casual tone as always. He answered the same way. There was no need to tell a long story, no need to summarize a victory. Some experiences only need to be lived through. As he left, he caught his reflection in the glass, not sharp, not faded, simply clear. That evening, Ethan called his mother. The conversation was brief and warm. He said that everything was fine, and this time it was a truth without footnotes. He hung up his jacket, sat down, and allowed the quiet to settle. There were no more gears that needed to turn. The machine had finished its task. What remained was a new rhythm, slower and more durable. Natalie, in her room, opened the window and let the city noise rush in. She took a deep breath and accepted the emptiness as part of learning. She did not hope to return. She hoped to move forward, even if the path was unclear. Some lessons arrive only after the cost has been fully paid. Ethan stood before the mirror and met his own gaze. No pride, no regret. Only the acknowledgement that he had chosen correctly, not because of the outcome, but because of the way he walked the path. He turned off the lights and let the room sink into gentle darkness. Outside, the city continued to breathe steady and patient. The story did not end with applause. It ended with intentional quiet. Because sometimes the greatest strength is not in winning against someone else, but in no longer needing to win at all. If you felt this journey, leave a comment to share your thoughts. Do not forget to like and subscribe to stay with the next stories where truth is told through calm and choices are paid for with growth.